Right now, it's time for the last word, where Ali Velshi is in for Lawrence tonight. Good evening, Ali. It's a big night.
Hi, my friend. It is. And thanks for that amazing coverage of it. You know, I think a lot of people assumed it would be at least 51-49. And then Mitch McConnell, of course, voting against Pete Hegseth. I know you've been very busy covering it all night. So I don't know if you've seen the one pager that that Mitch McConnell put out. But if I can just read a couple of things to you. He makes a reference in a paragraph to George Marshall and to Caspar Weinberger and to Bob Gates and the kinds of shoes that Pete Hegseth is going to fill. He then says, quote, mere desire to be a change agent is not enough to fill these shoes, and dust on boots fails even to distinguish this nominee from multiple predecessors of the last decade, nor is it a precondition for success. Secretaries with distinguished combat experience and time in the trenches have failed at the job. Mr. Hegseth has failed as yet to demonstrate that he will pass this test, but as he assumes office, the consequences of failure are as high as they have ever been. And fundamentally, that's the issue, that you can like Pete Hegseth, you can think he has retrograde views on women and women in combat, and all of that would normally be disqualifying. You could have an issue with his drinking, but we're in a dangerous world right now, Rachel, and Pete Hegseth is going to lead the Defense Department.
Yeah, Pete Hegseth is going to lead the Defense Department as this new president is not ruling out the use of military force to expand the borders of the United States, to take, in his words, to take the Panama Canal. He is threatening military force against one of our NATO allies. We all know what happens when a non-NATO country threatens a country in NATO. Well, all the NATO countries are treaty bound to respond to them and to help defense. When one NATO country threatens military force against another, as Donald Trump is now doing to Denmark, of all places, nobody exactly knows what that means. We also have a new president who is refusing to publicly discuss whether or not he is in direct contact with the president of Russia, while today he has just cut off all foreign aid to Ukraine. Yeah. So in a normal, like a week ago, this was a very dangerous world.
Yes, correct.
But what has just happened in the past week makes the world feel like it is spinning on a different axis than it used to be. And to have Pete Hegseth be the guy in charge of our nuclear deterrent and the 3 million men and women of the Defense Department, just it's
gives you pause.
Something gives me pause. Yeah. Thank you.
You have a great evening and a great weekend, my friend.
Thanks, Ali.
Just moments ago, as we've been discussing, the Senate voted to confirm Donald Trump's pick to lead the world's most powerful military, Pete Hegseth, as defense secretary, by one tie-breaking vote. It's almost unprecedented. J.D. Vance rushed to the Senate floor to get Hegseth over the finish line after 3 Republican senators defied Trump and voted against Hegseth. 2 we expected, Senator Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, because they voted against him in committee. But the former Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, voted against him, too. Now, ahead of her no vote on Pete Hegseth's confirmation, Senator Susan Collins said this.
I ended up having a number of concerns. They had to do with his lack of experience in managing an organization as large and as complex as the Pentagon, given that he had had a decidedly mixed record in managing 2 very small nonprofit veterans organizations where there were allegations of wasted money and mismanagement. In addition, we're facing a world right now where the threats have arguably not been this high since World War II. And I felt that we needed an individual who not only had the experience and qualifications, but also the perspective to run that giant department in the face of these global threats. He seemed very eager to do a wholesale firing of generals and admirals and other high-ranking officers at a time when we need their expertise and dedication. So in the end, to me, it was the right decision, much as my inclination is to try to give deference to the president.
Are you concerned
Thanks,
that there
Frank.
might be some blowback from Trump allies, Trump himself?
Oh, there already is. There already is. And I'm sure there will be more.
There already is blowback, and I'm sure there'll be more. That's what Senator Susan Collins, Senators McConnell and Senator Murkowski are facing tonight, because that's what happens when Republicans break ranks and oppose Donald Trump. And the former Fox Weekend host, with allegations of sexual misconduct and excessive drinking, all of which he denies, will now lead 1.3 million active duty troops and 1.4 million in the National Guard, reserves, and civilian employees based around the world, including the thousands of Muslims who serve in the military, according to a complaint filed by an employee of Concerned Veterans for America, where Hegseth served as president of that nonprofit advocacy group. Pete Hegseth drunkenly chanted, "Kill all Muslims, kill all Muslims," while at a bar on an official tour through Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. The majority of Senate Republicans voted tonight to keep Donald Trump from having to choose a new nominee. I think at this point, what's interesting is the consequences of the soon-to-be Defense Secretary Hegseth on the rest of us. No American defense secretary has ever received this level of Senate opposition to their confirmation. Why did Trump do this? This could have been a layup. Marco Rubio sailed through his confirmation in the United States Senate unanimously, despite the fact that half of that House doesn't share Marco Rubio's views on a lot of things. Do you think Senators Collins and Murkowski and all Democrats would have opposed the Defense Secretary nominee Joni Ernst or the Defense Secretary nominee Tom Cotton? So why Pete Hegseth? Was it just to show that Donald Trump can force Republican Senates to bend to his will, even on the worst nominees? This could be a win the battle but lose the war situation, literally. Trump doesn't have that kind of political capital to spare. The president who claims he got a landslide won with 49% of the vote. 50% of American voters voted for someone else. He starts his presidency with 47% approval, according to a new Reuters poll. Only 19% of adults approve of Pete Hegseth. But forget the domestic political audience paying attention to this. What's more important is that our adversaries are watching. Do American adversaries look at Donald Trump's determination to force through a nominee with a record of reported public drunkenness and difficulty with impulse control and see strength? Do American adversaries see a commander-in-chief who demanded that General Mark Milley's portrait at the Pentagon be removed? I'm not sure a whole lot of us knew that there was a portrait of Milley at the Pentagon, but now it's gone, 10 days after it was unveiled. Is that pettiness, or is that misplaced power? A lot of questions here. Joining us is Tom Nichols, Professor Emeritus at the United States Naval War College and staff writer at The Atlantic, and Jennifer Rubin, co-founder and editor-in-chief of The Contrarian. She's also an MSNBC political analyst. Good evening to both of you. Thank you for being with us. Tom, let me just start with you, because there are a few buckets of concerns about Pete Hegseth. One is his views and his behavior, which you almost think is sort of tertiary to the fact that he also has not run a large organization. He's run a couple of small organizations, and he has apparently done that very badly. And three is we are a world in danger at levels that have not seen until since pre-World War I and pre-World War II. We're really a tinderbox right now, and we need all the care that we can give this world. I sense your biggest concern lies in bucket three.
Well, you know, it's the game of horrible alternatives to have to choose which thing you're worried about most, that he lacks the character to lead the U.S. Armed Forces, that he has no experience and will be almost, certainly be in over his head during a crisis, trying to advise the president. But yeah, I mean, the first thing I thought when Vance broke the tie was that I could just, having been to Moscow many times and walked past their defense ministry, I could just see them sitting inside the Ministry of Defense and looking at each other and saying, this can't be real. We couldn't have lucked out this way, to have someone this inexperienced and flawed. And also someone who, the Senate sent a message, someone who doesn't really have the overwhelming confidence of the American people's elected representatives. If
Right.
you have to become Secretary of Defense by one tie-breaking vote, that's a nomination that should have been pulled, because you can do that with, if you want to, with the Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary of Commerce, a lot of other
Yep.
things. You can't do that with the Secretary of Defense, and yet here we are.
Yeah, it's an intriguing point, Jennifer, because the vice president in a close Senate, including Vice President Kamala Harris, broke ties all the time. Not ties like this, not on things that are this important. And as I listed in the intro, there were lots of Republicans who would have gotten overwhelming support, even from Democrats, because people do accept what Susan Collins says. Generally speaking, the president gets their nominee unless there's a problem. There's a problem here.
Yeah, there sure is. And you asked why Trump would do it. It's several reasons. First of all, he does want to embarrass the Senate and bend them to his will. Secondly, his entire mission is to decapitate and disable functional government. So by putting in entirely incompetent toadies, he goes a long way towards doing that. Once the government is rid of professionals, of skilled expertise, then Donald Trump can careen from one side of the street to the other, taking the American people and our national security with us. And I must say, it is remarkable during a week in which these people made such an issue of DEI, meaning in their aim, hiring people who are not qualified, that they would have had this pathetic specimen as Secretary of Defense. This is the worst kind of DEI for white incompetent drunks. And this should not be tolerated. It shouldn't be tolerated for someone who is, as you point out, the Secretary of Agriculture. And it shouldn't be tolerated for someone who is going to run an organization in which any of this behavior would have been disqualifying. You cannot be in the military and be a drunk. You cannot be in the military, be an officer, and be guilty of, for example, disloyalty to one's spouse. You cannot be in the military and miscarry and misappropriate funds. All of this is disqualifying. So what does this send as a message down the troops? It's anything goes, so long as you're a loyalist to Trump will accept any kind of behavior. And so what will happen is the good people will leave at the end of their service. The bad people will rise up. And you know what happened in Russia when they operated on a patronage system, a cronyism system, a corruption system? They got a military that is getting their ass kicked in Ukraine. And that's what happens when a military becomes corrupted. They become weak, they become ineffective, and the national security of their country suffers.
So just for the record, Pete Hegseth himself has denied drunkenness and misappropriation of funds. He has said, however, if he is made defense secretary, he's going to give up drinking. Worth keeping an eye on that space. Tom Nichols, Jen Rubin talks about the good people leaving and the bad people staying. The good news, or maybe the hope, and I think I tried this with you a week ago, and you didn't bite, is that there are a lot of good senior people in the military who 20, 25, 30, 35 years ago made a commitment to risk their lives for the safety of this country, who might not roll over for a Pete Hegseth or a Donald Trump. What's your sense of that?
Yeah, look, I think you're going to have two things happening. I've said for years that Donald Trump is the patron saint of the third string. He is the person who takes people who normally wouldn't be qualified for anything. He elevates them to remarkable heights. That's going to happen it's happened at the very top of the DOD, and it's going to happen in DOD staffing. And sure, I'm going to guess that there will be people in the DOD who are going to decide that, this is a good time to leave federal service. I still believe, and, again, from years of teaching officers, in the really magnificent professionalism of the U.S. Officer Corps, that I think is going to keep a lot of people doing the best job they can do, regardless of who's at the top, either of the Pentagon or in the White House. That is their apolitical code of service, and thank God for it. But there are going to be people that in the Pentagon, I'm sure, who are going to have heartburn with saying Secretary Hegseth. And I think the other thing that's going to happen, Ali, that will drive people out is that when you have a very weak Secretary of Defense like this who has no experience, he's not going to be running the place. I mean, I've brought this up before. There are going to be people that say, look, I don't really feel like taking orders from a deputy assistant secretary of defense. I've just been here too long. And, this isn't, this is chaos. Now, let me just add one proviso. I really hope we're all wrong. I mean, for the good of the country, I hope all three of us are wrong. But as a man who recreationally gambles, I would tell you that's not the bet I would make.
Jennifer Rubin, it's a bit of a day late, dollar short situation, but McConnell had some strong words. I also remembered McConnell having some strong words after January 6th. Didn't amount to much. But he's got some strong words about the fact that the defense secretary is usually somebody who has the support of the American people, or at least the elected officials, as Tom said. Pete Hegseth doesn't rise above any bar here, and he's not setting himself up for success. McConnell saying it, relevant, not relevant?
Maybe he should have thought about this before he endorsed Donald Trump. He knew very well these were the kind of people that Donald Trump would have chosen. So maybe he should have thought back to that impeachment trial. Maybe he should have thought back to the election. Maybe he should have spoken up once in his career for the good of the country. It is too late now. And you'll notice that he is completely without influence with his colleagues. Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins will occasionally, perhaps more occasionally than we otherwise have seen, do the right thing because they have some sense of responsibility. The rest of them are lost, and McConnell no longer has any sway. He has lost his perch, and now he is crying in the wilderness, just like those Democrats used to do, who he used to mock, who he used to steamroll over. So frankly, I'm not all that impressed with what he's doing. It's sort of nice that he's come along. Welcome to the resistance, but it doesn't make a dime's worth of difference. And it would be very nice if he would go back and do some mea culpas and talk to some of his colleagues about the danger they have now taken on themselves. Every screw up, every scandal, every casualty, every mismanagement in the Pentagon, they own because they voted for this guy, knowing he was an incompetent fool. And McConnell might want to put them, up to that, might remind them of this. What I would say is this: the only good thing about this is maybe some of them will think twice and three times about confirming even more ridiculous nominees like Tulsi Gabbard or Kash Patel. Guys, you don't want to vote against all of them. Just vote, pick one of them to knock out. Pick just one. Maybe Tulsi Gabbard, who's the Assad stooge.
I haven't had a whole lot of surprises to the upside this week, Jennifer. But hey, you know what? I'll take them. Next week's a new week. We'll see what happens. Thanks to both of you. Great to see you both, Jennifer Rubin and Tom Nichols. Thanks very much for being with us on this on an eventful night. All right, coming up, what Trump's attempt to end birthright citizenship by decree is really all about. That's next. Today marks 26 days until the most blatantly unconstitutional order ever seen by one Reagan-appointed federal judge takes effect. That order came from Donald Trump. Judge John Kuhnauer, appointed to the bench by Ronald Reagan in 1981, signed a temporary restraining order yesterday blocking Trump's attempt to override the 14th Amendment's guarantee of birthright citizenship through executive fiat. The judge told Trump's DOJ, quote, "There are other times in world history where we look back and people of goodwill can say, where were the judges? Where were the lawyers?" End quote. In U.S. history, we've seen those times in Supreme Court decisions that deprived classes of people of the rights of citizenship. Like the Dred Scott decision, which held that enslaved black people were not citizens and could not expect protection from the federal government, a shameful decision that the 14th Amendment to the Constitution was intended to override. Or the Korematsu decision, which allowed the internment of Japanese Americans. We talk about Japanese. They weren't Japanese. They were Japanese Americans. Modern world history is filled with other shameful times when nations acted to strip dissidents, minorities, or other marginalized groups of citizenship to render them essentially stateless. Less than 2 years ago, Vladimir Putin signed Russia's new citizenship law, adding new grounds for denaturalization, like, for example, spreading what the Kremlin calls fake news about its war in Ukraine. I think what Trump wants is to create a new class of others to aim animus at. Trump needs to keep coming up with new scapegoats, new people to be blamed and hated, because he can't deliver his promised revanchist fantasia of America. In a normal America, Trump's attempt to overrule the Constitution's plain language by decree would be laughed out of the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court has shown us with the Dobbs decision and with the Trump immunity decision that it will do anything. But for now, the norm holds. Joining us now is the Attorney General of the state that stopped Donald Trump's birthright citizenship executive order in court yesterday, Washington State Attorney General Nick Brown. Attorney Brown, good to see you. Thank you for being with us. Where do we go from here? What happens next? This is a 14-day stay that went into effect yesterday. The judge was pretty clear about what he thought, but what effect does that have?
Well, thank you, Alex. Good to be here. We're obviously very thrilled with the result that we got yesterday. It is only a temporary restraining order, so it'll be in effect for 14 days from yesterday. We now have a new briefing schedule on a motion for preliminary injunction, which would have a longer lasting effect if the judge granted that preliminary motion, which, based on the comments that he made yesterday, that would be the hope that we would have moving forward. But we have a long way to go. We're obviously only at the district court level, and we need to move forward with briefing on this case. But to hear the judge say from the bench that this was blatantly unconstitutional, that he hadn't seen something in his 4 decades on the bench that was so plainly clear, that is a great start for this case. And we have other cases across the country brought by my colleagues as well. So this is a great way to proceed.
That's what I wanted to ask you about. 18 states in total, maybe more will join, are involved in somehow pushing back on this. What does that look like to you? Is that going to end up as one big case, or is it going to be 18 different assaults on this, essentially this assault on the Constitution?
Well, right now there's 2 separate cases brought by groups of attorney generals across the country. So we led a case here in Washington with 3 other states, Illinois, Arizona, and Oregon. And then there's a case filed in the District of Massachusetts, led by New Jersey, Massachusetts, New York, and some of my other colleagues. And those cases will continue to proceed together. There are also separate cases brought by the ACLU and some other private parties challenging the same unconstitutional and un-American ban on birthright citizenship. But those cases are going to be held and heard independently. Obviously, as the cases move forward, decisions by one court will be considered by the other courts, but those are separate matters for now.
What's your sense of this? Is there a legal strategy behind what the Trump administration is doing, or is this kind of a cultural, hey, let's invent a new group for people to target?
Well, President Trump, all throughout his career as a politician, has certainly led with hate and fear-mongering and trying to target people as others to drive up his own popularity. And that so many decisions that he made in his first term and has already made in these first few days are driven by that. There is a sort of fringe legal theory that the 14th Amendment does not, in fact, say what it says, that it does not, in fact, stand for what it has stood for the last 150 years. For years, that has been disregarded by legal scholars and judges and the Supreme Court itself. But this fringe legal theory is something the Trump administration is trying to hang their hat on. Based on what we heard yesterday in court and based on what the Supreme Court has said itself, we don't anticipate that that'll gain much support moving forward, but we have to take it one step at a time.
Yeah, there's 100 years of precedent in the Supreme Court about this particular matter. So we look forward to talking to you more as this proceeds. Washington State Attorney General Nick Brown, thank you for joining us tonight. Coming up, Donald Trump was so sure he could end Russia's war in Ukraine on day 1 in office. So now it's been 5 days, and Donald Trump has failed to deliver on his promise to end the war on day 1. That's next.
I'll end that war between those 2 countries in 24 hours. It won't even take that long.
End the war in Ukraine in 24 hours.
Yes, I do.
How would you do that?
I know Zelensky very well. I would fix that within 24 hours. And if I win, before I get into the office, I will have that war settled. 100% sure.
Okay, so that's even better than solving it in 24 hours. It was going to be settled before he took office. That's negative hours. On the campaign trail, Donald Trump repeatedly made that obviously ridiculous claim that he could end the war in Ukraine on or before his first day in office. Okay, now it's day 5, and Donald Trump has failed to end Russia's war on Ukraine. Today marks exactly 2 years and 11 months since Vladimir Putin invaded a sovereign country, and Donald Trump still doesn't know who is responsible for this war.
He shouldn't have allowed this to happen either.
No.
You know, if he's no angel,
Right.
He shouldn't have allowed this war to happen.
He shouldn't have allowed the war to happen. He's no angel. He's talking about Volodymyr Zelensky. Trump thinks Zelensky is to blame for Putin's imperialism, for Putin moving troops into Ukraine. Despite thinking Ukraine is to blame for its own invasion, Trump now claims that he will tariff Russia into a peace deal. Here's what he just said in an interview with Fox.
I put out a truth today that's really strong, and I mean it. And if they don't do that, I'm going to put massive
if
tariffs.
They don't do what?
If they don't settle this war soon, like almost immediately, I'm going to put massive tariffs on Russia and massive taxes and also big sanctions. And I don't want to do that. You know, I love the Russian people. They're great people. I don't want to do that, but we got to get this war ended. And if they don't make a settlement like fast.
What a great idea. Big sanctions on Russia. There are big sanctions on Russia. The Wall Street Journal reports that the Kremlin doesn't seem particularly bothered by Trump's threats. The spokesman there, Dmitry Peskov, saying, quote, "We don't see anything new here," end quote. Because it isn't anything new. I alone can fix it. I can end the war in a day. It's easy to say from the cheap seats on the campaign trail. Now all Trump has to actually do is actually do it. Joining us now, Michael McFaul, who served as the United States ambassador to Russia from 2012 to 2014. He's an MSNBC international affairs analyst. I apologize for insulting your intelligence by bringing you on to have this conversation, Ambassador, but I guess we got to have it because neither you nor I nor anybody who watches the show thought the war was ending in a day when Donald Trump took office. But what's the plan here?
I don't think he has a plan, to be honest. Obviously, he didn't end the war in day one. He hasn't ended on day 5. He's barely proposed anything. Second, it's clear that he, just as you said, but we need to keep underscoring it, he doesn't know the facts about the war. Obviously, President Zelensky did not cause this war. They tried to kill him when they invaded the country. I want to be clear about that. Several times, they tried to kill President Zelensky. He did not ask for this war. And by the way, when we're getting to the facts, if Trump really wanted to stop Putin from invading, he was the president of the United States of America for 4 years. He could have sent Javelins, he could have sent Stingers, HIMARS, ATACMS, Patriots, all these weapon systems. Those were all in our arsenal. That would have helped to prevent the war. He did nothing of that. So let's remember that second fact. Third, I'm glad and pleased that President Trump is finally starting to think about coercive steps towards Vladimir Putin. He said more negative things about Putin in the last couple of days than he said in 10 years. That's new. That's different, right? He's destroying his country. But then we have to address the facts, as you hinted at. When's the last time you bought something from Russia? What tariffs? What tariffs are we going to put on? We don't buy goods from Russia, so we have nothing to tariff. Second, on sanctions, I applaud that he wants to do more sanctions, but as you said, we've put other sanctions in place already, and the revenues that are most central and the technology that is most central for supporting Putin come from China. So that means we have to put secondary sanctions on China to stop them from buying Russian oil and gas and to stop them from providing the Russian military complex with technology. I hope he can do that. I fear he cannot.
I have to ask you this because you were on the diplomatic side of the world, the soft power side of America. But tonight we've been talking a lot about the hard power side of America with the nomination of Pete Hegseth and the approval of that nomination by the U.S. Senate. What effect does that have on decision making in the headquarters of our adversaries, but particularly in this case in Russia? As they look at tonight and they look at this Trump administration and they look at Pete Hegseth, what are they thinking?
Well, I also served 3 years at the National Security Council at the White House, where we dealt with a lot of hard power issues. And I want to say 2 things about that. One, they like to see this. This is not a gentleman that has any competency and experience. I wish him well, by the way.
Yes.
He's got a very important job now that he's nominated. I hope he'll take that job seriously. But this is not General Mattis. Let's just be clear. And our adversaries know that. They like that. 2, they see us divided, 50-50. That's good for them. But 3, and I think this is the part that is not getting enough attention. I mentioned that I worked at the National Security Council, and I sat in meetings with President Obama and with his national security team. That's one of the key places where you need a strong Secretary of Defense when he's sitting next to the president, giving him advice about the most consequential decisions that a president can make. I'm not confident that Secretary Hegseth has that ability to say those tough things to President Trump. I hope I'm wrong, but nothing I've seen in the behavior between them suggests that. When I worked there, it was Secretary Gates, a Republican, a man with decades of experience. I saw him give tough advice to President Obama every single day.
Right.
I hope that will be the case. I fear it will not be.
Let's talk very quickly about the space you said that seems to be developing between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Space we didn't see for the entire first Trump administration, the entire time Donald Trump was not president. Why now? Why in the first 5 days, rather than ending the war, is he finally saying things that are critical about Vladimir Putin?
Your guess is as good as mine. I know more about Putin than I know about President Trump. But if I had to guess, I think he thinks that this is helping his mediation strategy, right? This art of the deal. I'm going to put some pressure on him. I'm going to threaten him with these things, and then he's going to come to the negotiating table. I just think he's wrong in his calculations. I don't think that's going to work with Putin. I think Putin thinks Trump's going to focus on this for a little while, not get any headway, and then he'll forget about it. And that's when Putin will win. That's when he will succeed. I hope I'm wrong, but that's the way, when I look at the way Putin is talking about it, he's going to wait this all out.
Ambassador, good to see you tonight. Thank you for joining us, as always, Ambassador Michael McFaul. All right, coming up, Robert Reich joins us on Elon Musk's design for the federal government. That's next. A decade ago, Elon Musk was the tech world's golden child. He had cornered the market on electric cars. He was building the world's most advanced space vehicles. He was promising to take humanity to Mars. Fast forward to now. He's tarnished his reputation with a huge portion of the population by hitching his wagon to Donald Trump, throwing gobs of money into our politics to help Trump retake the presidency. On top of that, he bought Twitter, inexplicably abandoning the brand recognition that platform had, only to rename it after his preferred letter of the alphabet and turn the once influential social media site into a cesspool of lies, conspiracy theories, and hate. A line from a Texas Monthly article published last month about Tesla's love it or hate it Cybertruck sums all of this up perfectly. A year after its debut, the Cybertruck has come to embody Tesla's infamous CEO, with critics suggesting it's as defective and unreliable as Elon Musk himself. All of that, plus some stiff competition from other car makers, led Tesla to falling below 50% of the market share of electric car sales in America last summer. Not to worry. Musk is slinking around Washington, getting his hands into the federal government with Donald Trump's blessing. A new Wall Street Journal poll found only 39% approve of Donald Trump, relying on Musk as an advisor, ostensibly to figure out how to streamline the federal government. Another poll today from the Associated Press found 60% of the country thinks it's a bad idea for Donald Trump to be relying on billionaires like Musk for policy advice at all. But there they were, Mark Zuckerberg of Meta, Jeff Bezos of Amazon, Sundar Pichai of Google, right there with Elon Musk on Inauguration Day, sitting in front of Donald Trump's cabinet nominees. Remember that oligarchy taking shape that President Biden warned us about on his way out of office? Well, back to Musk for a moment. Why is the world's richest man getting knee-deep into the public sector? Well, some interesting new reporting from Wired is providing an exceedingly plausible answer to that question. Quote, as one of his first acts after being sworn in, President Donald Trump signed an executive order establishing the Department of Government Efficiency by reorganizing and renaming an existing entity, the U.S. Digital Services, as the U.S. DOGE Service. DOGE is Department of Government Efficiency. And while some have noted that this version of DOGE moves away from the sweeping vision of deregulation outlined in a November Wall Street Journal op-ed, it's a move that will give centibillionaire Elon Musk and his allies seemingly unprecedented insight across the government and access to troves of federal data. It's quite a clever way of integrating DOGE into the federal government that I think will work in the sense of giving it a platform for surveillance and recommendations, says Richard Pierce, a law professor at George Washington University. Joining us now, Robert Reich, who served as the Secretary of Labor under President Bill Clinton. He's a professor of public policy at UC Berkeley. He's the co-founder of Inequality Media. And if you have any interest in this oligarchy nonsense, I think he's publishing every single day. Professor Reich, good to see you. Thanks for being with us. This is an interesting, just a side note on why Elon Musk wants to be in the White House. Literally, he wants his office to be in the White House. Remember when Amazon was going around trying to sell every city in the country on establishing its centers, and it gathered all this information on all those cities, and somehow Amazon now knows everything about everything in the country. There's something to be said for being at the center of the power when you are trying to control the levers of power.
Absolutely, Ali. In fact, power today is not just wealth, it's information, it's data, it's knowing what it is that everybody else is doing. And certainly, if you have all of the data that government has and you have access to it and you can slice it and dice it any way you want, that can translate into great wealth and great power.
So here's something interesting. Tesla dropped below 50% of all electric vehicle sales in the United States. That means other American companies or other companies' cars are being sold. There are 0 Chinese electric vehicles in America. For better or for worse, there are 0. So these are all other competitors. But guess what? He got an executive order this week eliminating incentives for other electric car producers. So kind of works, right? If you're Elon Musk, that was a pretty good investment in Donald Trump's campaign.
Absolutely. In fact, look under the hood, as it were, Ali, and what you always find is monopolization. In fact, every time you follow the money and you're dealing with one of these current robber barons, in the second Gilded Age, that's what they are. They are the new generation of robber barons. You follow the money and you get to a monopoly because that's where the big money is. Combine the monopoly with data. Combine power that is market power with power that is information power, and you get Elon Musk.
However, on Inauguration Day, you published something which actually gave me hope. I'd like to read from it. Trump hoodwinked the average working American into believing that he's on their side and convinced enough voters that Kamala Harris and Democrats were on the side of cultural elites. But Trump's hoax will not work for long, given the oligarchy's conspicuous takeover of America under Trump, too. Trump's regime is already exposing a reality that has been hidden from most Americans for decades: the oligarchy's obscene wealth and its use of that wealth to gain power over America. This is an interesting point. And Professor Tim Snyder has mentioned the fact that people over time turn against these oligarchies. It doesn't always mean a turn back to democracy, but they once they realize that they're being exploited, they tend to not like it so much.
Americans in particular, Ali, have an aversion to aristocracy. I mean, after all, we were founded in revolt against monarchy and against an aristocracy in Britain. We really don't like elites who are enormously powerful. The thing is that the Republican Party has used cultural populism over the last 10, 20 years to paint the elites as basically a deep state or, people who are coming into this country illegally or people who are transgender. I mean, there is a different elite here that is really operating and pulling the levers of power, and that elite is an economic elite. The Democrats really have not talked enough, in my humble opinion, about the economic elite that is actually and has actually undermined American democracy over the last 30 or 40 years.
Right. A lot of people have gone after the academic elite or whatever they think the elite is, the ivory towers. But in fact, in the midst of all this, for the last 50 years, what's been happening is we've just got this class of people who are now 0.01% of the population controlling more wealth than the entire bottom half of the population.
Yes, and that's exactly the point, because they control the wealth. And what do they do with their wealth? They put a chunk of it into politics. There is the oligarchy. That's the oligarchy in action. That's what Elon Musk did, putting $250 million not $250,000, $250 million to get Donald Trump elected is the quintessence of what we face in an oligarchy. That's what oligarchies do. That's how they wed monopoly power and the power of just politics. That's what Elon Musk represents. That's what that picture that you showed of the three richest people in the United States in front of all the Republicans, in front of all of the people who are being nominated to high positions of power. These are the most powerful people in the world, and Musk is embracing them. He is not a tribune of the people. Musk is not somebody who's there for working class Americans, and it's going to be obvious. If it's not obvious already, it will be obvious. He's going to give them a huge tax cut. And what's Musk going to do? He's going to find ways of cutting programs that average people rely on.
Yeah, he warned everybody, you're in for a tough time if the economy goes sour for a while. He's not talking about his friends. He's not in for a tough time. Robert Reich, good to see you as always. Thank you for this conversation. Robert Reich is a former United States Secretary of Labor. We'll be right back. A programming note before we go. In the middle of California, there's a 450-mile stretch of agricultural land tended by Mexican and Mexican-American laborers for generations. It is in those fruit and almond fields where Manuel Munoz's collection of short stories called The Consequences takes place, and where a young Munoz, his siblings, and his parents all worked. The Consequences depicts the realities of life for so many families, from the physical toll of the labor to the ruthless roundup by La Migra. The Consequences is an unflinching work that every American should read right now. So don't miss this painfully timely meeting of the Velshi Van Book Club featuring The Consequences and the award-winning author Manuel Munoz tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern. I hope you'll join us. That's tonight's last word.